This time on Poll Hub, Ukraine has been in the news a lot this week, and things are changing as we speak. Trump and Putin have met. Russia and Ukraine have appeared to make some moves towards a ceasefire, but the missiles and drones have not stopped flying across their borders in both directions. So we're checking to see how Americans and Ukrainians think about all of this and how that has changed over the 11 years of this war. Then, Pope Francis appears to be on the mend after a recent medical scare, but his hospitalization reminds us his reign will at some point end. So we're talking with religious scholar Daniel Speed Thompson from the University of Dayton to discuss his papacy and what might come next. And we finish with...
Achoo!
God bless you.
Gesundchen Leben geht ihr gesund.
Grab a tissue. Stick around. And hi, everybody. Welcome to Poll Hub. I'm JD Dapper.
I'm Barbara Carvalho.
I'm Mary Griffith.
And I'm Lee Waringoff.
Ukraine has been in the news all week. We are recording this on Thursday afternoon. So who knows what's going to happen between now and in 12 hours or 24 hours from now when you're actually listening to this. There's been a lot of movement. And this comes after, as I mentioned in the open, 11 years of war. When we were putting the segment together, I had to triple check that. 11 years. Since Russia first invaded and took over Crimea. It has been over 3 years since the actual massive invasion that kind of started off this second phase. Before we get to numbers, including the amount of money that's been spent and what Americans think about all this, let's get a quick sense on the panel here of what your take is about this week and what it means for this war that is the first major land war in Europe since World War II that risks destabilizing what was a fairly stable relationship in Europe for since the end of World War II. Lee, let's start with you.
I would say it's sort of reminiscence, not the right word, because that sort of suggests going back in time, but it sounds a little bit like the whole Gaza Middle East thing to me, where we're close, we're not close, we're having a settlement. I think we're going to have to just wait and see what does occur and what is any solution, because there's a lot at stake. And, I'm sure we're going to talk about there's really a geopolitical difference that's happened. And if you're Zelensky and you're looking at Trump and you're looking at Putin and you're wanting to know how many friends do you have around the table, it's a very different picture maybe than it was not too long ago. So I think there's all that going on too. So where it ends up, one doesn't really know at this point. Barb, what's your take on it?
What I do find that is very interesting is that although we have had conflicts and wars over the last century, we have had a very stable geopolitical global relationships. Mm-hmm. And so I think what we're witnessing now, and Ukraine, it's just one example of that, is an upheaval of those relationships that have really been in place for decades and for certainly our lives and most people's lives who are still on the planet. To see the U.S. at this point allies for all intents and purposes with Russia, to see us distancing ourselves to what have been our allies for quite some time in Europe, I think is very unnerving. And I think Ukraine is our first test of these new relationships and this new dynamic. Now, remember, even in World War II, that was more a relationship with the Soviet Union out of convenience, because we both had a lot at stake against the Axis powers. So I think this is something that's unusual. I think it's very different. And I'm not sure that there really are any roadmaps to follow or to look back on to understand what is happening. And you mentioned, Jay, this has really been going on for 11 years, and there has been friction for even much longer than that. And I think that it's certainly something to be watched, and certainly something that we may really not have a great crystal ball about this time.
To underscore that, I'd just jump in quickly and say, in my class, in political communications were looking at some TV campaign ads, and I put in the famous bear ad from 1984, which was the Reagan ad, which, if some of you remember, the metaphorical enemy was this bear, which was obviously the Soviet Union. And you don't even have to go back to the Cuban Missile Crisis to go deep into the Cold War. But I know that was very memorable for me. Obviously, it's ancient history for students right now, but it really underscores the point just how the sides have changed and the alter of the Allied coalitions. I mean, it's a different ballgame.
So let's talk about America's role in this and American public opinion. And I also want to, there's some Ukrainian public opinion. It's hard to believe, and I do want to hit this before we get to another segment, but I do want to ask you, Barb, what you think about polling in the last 3 or 4 years in Ukraine of Ukrainians, and it has happened. We're going to talk about that in a minute. First off, money. America has spent $175 billion since the February 2022 invasion. Last month, in a Pew poll, 30% of Americans said that the U.S. government was spending too much money on Ukraine. 23% said about right. 22% said not enough. So not quite a third. It's more like a quarter, a third. And then some undecideds. When CBS News and YouGov asked a year ago, in February 2024, 51% said we should be sending military aid to Ukraine. 49% said we should not. So there's been a split for some time here among whether what we're doing is, at least in terms of sending arms and money, is right, the right amount, whether we should be doing it at all. One last number from a 2024 Gallup survey, and this was in December, so only a few months ago. Only 10% of Americans think Ukraine is winning the war. So I think some of the arguments that the Trump administration is making, which is that it's just bodies piling up and there is no end in sight and nobody's winning, I think it certainly has some resonance with some Americans. So having said all of that, where are we? Foreign affairs, foreign policy is rarely a top 5 even issue with Americans. Has that changed now, or are we in the same situation where, look, inflation, costs, the potential for a recession, the collapsing of government agencies, is Ukraine just another one of these kind of foreign policy things that for most Americans is, yeah, over there?
Well, I think certainly the war has resonated with Americans, but I don't think that Donald Trump would be president if it was top of mind. It was very clear that he has a special relationship with Russia and with Putin. And it was clear that even during the campaign, he said, oh, yeah, I can solve this.
24 hours.
Day one. And the assumption there was that basically he would force Ukraine to give in to Russia. And so I think if it were something that were motivating and top of mind, we would be looking at very different things here. I think, though, that there is a sense that you have a democracy there. I think the country has always been split for a number of years now. Not always been split, but for a number of years has been split between whether China or Russia is the bigger threat. If you look at our economy and if you have economics top of mind, you clearly think that China is the bigger threat to the United States, and that given the history between China and Russia and the feeling that the U.S. needs to take one side or the other, they would probably rather work with, as we see in this current administration, a political enemy rather than an economic enemy. You see those numbers. I think the Trump administration has certainly, and Republicans in general, have been able to make a strong argument for why Ukraine is not where we want to make the stand.
So have we just moved to isolation, Lee?
I don't think we know now where the Trump foreign policy doctrine is going, because it's sort of been,
you're assuming there is one.
Yeah,
and I think that's a leap of faith to say that there's a plan.
But okay, so we don't really
know.
I don't
know. Come on, guys. I disagree to a certain extent because there is a lot of consistency. There's a lot of consistency in the decisions that are being made in this administration when it comes to Europe, when it comes to many of our other allies, when it comes to the relationship with Russia.
I was only saying, in a plan, there's an end game. and there's a strategy and there's a rationale for
I think
doing
this
it.
is very, very
That's what I'm
much
missing.
I think it's very much of the moment. And I think we do have entered into discussion internationally, things like Canada and Panama Canal and Greenland, lots of things that have become part of it. I don't know where any of those end up. I will say in some of our polls, I found it interesting that over the last 3 years, the number of people who think that the United States is sending too much support through Ukraine, which is around a third of the country, that has stayed very constant. The not enough support has grown from 20 to 37 over that time period. So it's interesting to me that there is still that sentiment that there's something about Ukraine and the democracy and something about Russia and Trump, and that it's still part of this American thought process. And where it ends up, I know some of the Republicans in the Senate were initially very gung-ho about supporting Ukraine. Obviously, that's been tempered.
Mitch McConnell is retiring, so
yes,
that's in that.
And Donald Trump has tempered that because of the lack of Republicans to want to draw a line in the sand, and not standing with Ukraine is part of that.
Before we move on, so Gallup has been interviewing Ukrainians for polling since early 2022. And in November 2024, the most recent survey, 38% of Ukrainians think Ukraine should continue fighting. That's down from 73% in 2022. And if you see the pictures, you see what's happened in that country, I don't think that's a surprise. 52% of Ukrainians think that Ukraine should negotiate an end to the war. That is up from 22% in 2022. And 52%, more than half of Ukrainians should agree that Ukraine should be open to making some territory concessions as a part of a peace deal. And finally, Barb, I just want to ask you about this. Ukrainians don't want the U.S. involved in peace talks. Most want the EU involved, 70%. Most want the UK involved, 63%. But very few want the United States involved. But polling, how do you poll? How do you poll in the midst of, you've seen pictures. How is that even possible?
Well, I think it's probably has a lot to do with Elon Musk and the fact that he has provided Starlink to Ukraine and allows Gallup to connect with people who have been part of the panel for some time. I mean, Gallup has global panels in many, many countries, some of which you wouldn't be able to get through or to in any other way. Now, certainly when we think statistically and scientifically about research panels, having had a war for 3 years is mind-boggling when it comes to the science of it, because I suspect no one is in the same place, either mentally, physically, or in any other way than they were when this thing started.
If you want to talk about changing methodology and changing technology and polls, Gallup got into all this almost 100 years ago, and they were doing face-to-face interviewing. So this is obviously kind of full circle now.
So let me give you the last word, Lee, on what those results showed, though, which is that a small majority of Ukrainians are essentially taking the position that after 3 years of this kind of war, and really after 11 years of war, giving up some territory for a peace deal is okay. That's not something that Americans were saying as recently as 2 or 3 months ago before the election. What does that say?
Yeah, I frankly, I was surprised by that number because it speaks to the destruction that's going on and how a relief of that is preferable to just the status quo, I guess, is just unacceptable.
Well, there won't be anything left of Ukraine if the status quo holds. I think that's probably what people in Ukraine are saying. So.
Well, Pope Francis's recent battle with pneumonia and extended hospital stay has drawn increased attention to the papacy and the Vatican. At the time of this recording, the Vatican has released a statement that Pope Francis's condition has improved. And of course, we do wish Pope Francis a speedy recovery. But this does raise the question of what does all of this mean for the future of the papacy when it does come time for a new pope to be chosen? Joining us today to provide some insight into that question is Dr. Daniel Speed Thompson, who is a faculty member in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Dayton. Dr. Thompson, welcome to the podcast today.
Thank you. I'm very glad to be here this afternoon.
Well, I did want to start off with just some quick numbers about Americans' perceptions about Pope Francis. Now, according to a very recent Pew study, 78% of U.S. Catholics have a favorable opinion of the pontiff. Now, in comparison to other popes in recent time, his favorability rating is on average higher than that of Pope Benedict XVI. However, it is lower than that of Pope John Paul II. And furthermore, Pew also found that 72% of U.S. Catholics think that Pope Francis represents a change in the direction of the Catholic Church. Now, included in that 72% are 42% of Catholics who believe that he represents a major change, and 30% believe he represents a minor change. So if you would just please put those numbers into context for us, what do you think accounts for American Catholics' views of Pope Francis?
Sure. Let me see if I can divide the question into a couple of parts, all right, and see if I can respond to it. First of all, going back to the popularity of Pope Saint John Paul II, just by way of comparison, I think that one of the things that perhaps contemporary listeners might not appreciate, but can maybe learn a little bit from, is that John Paul II was sort of the first major media star as Pope, right? He was a person who was much more conversant with and able to kind of use, and not in a bad sense, but he knew how to work with modern media in ways to make his message both accessible and popular and global in a way that I think no previous Pope had ever tried to do or did. And so it's not surprising to me that Catholics who argued about his legacy back then, also found him to be a very sort of appealing figure, a strong figure, a sort of a magnetic figure. And I think that Francis has had this same kind of effect, but in a different way, and maybe in a different media age, and a different kind of age of accessibility. I think that when I was looking at the same Pew poll that you folks had referred me to, what I was surprised by was actually that many Catholics do think of Pope Francis very highly, and even more conservative Catholics that might be identified with conservative forms of American politics, still think of him fairly highly, although maybe a little less so. They also do tend to see him as an agent of change. Sometimes those changes are not ones that they particularly might welcome. I think that some Catholics are concerned about what seems to be Pope Francis's more relaxed attitude and approaches towards issues of, let's say, LGBTQ people, concerning questions about the governance of the church, and other kinds of things that have made him at least suspicious to some, right? But what I was very interested to see is actually that even with that many Catholics actually still favor. So I think that what you see here is that he is still a very popular person for many Catholics, and that he is, even among those Catholics who might tend to disagree with him more, there's still a fairly high level of popularity.
When you think of now, as you mentioned, St. John Paul, and him being, I think most people considered him to be a kind of a revolutionary, right? He really changed the nature of the Catholic Church, not only in America, especially worldwide, less so for who came next. And then how does this Pope fit into the nature of the Church changing over decades or ages, if you will? How does he fit into this lineage?
I think the two things that he will be remembered by, and I don't wish to sort of write an obituary.
Right. Yeah. No. I was careful in asking the question because, again, this is not the legacy podcast for the Pope. He's alive and well. But we are looking ahead. So.
Yeah, I think the two things. One is both internal and external of the Church, and the other is largely internal. So let me do the first one. The first one is I think that he will be remembered for the groundbreaking letter on climate change and the relationship and the church's the relationship with the Church and the question of environmental change, environmental justice, about climate change. The Laudato Si, of course, came out in 2014, if I remember my dates correctly. That document and has had profound repercussions on both the Catholic Church internally, on discussions and institutions and so forth that are ramping up, so to speak, for the church to think about questions of and act on questions of the environment. And it also has made this Pope, Pope Francis, a particular kind of public figure in many circles where, to be very honest, the Catholic Church would not have gotten much of a hearing, right? So I live, if I may use a very quick example, I had students in one of my classes read a book on globalization, just a general book on globalization, right? And there's a chapter on environmental globalization. It talks about all sorts of environmental movements. And this is not a book written by a theologian or anybody inside the church. And in it, there's a big picture of Pope Francis talking at the UN, talking about the environmental questions and how the Pope has become a public figure. So I think that one of the things that will be a legacy of change, and this is his particular strong and consistent commitment to questions of the environment. Now, to be sure, this was not something brand new. His predecessors had talked about this, but Francis has really put a lot of emphasis on it and continued to do so in very, very strong language. And so I think that this has really had a profound effect. Okay, so that's one thing. All right, that's a kind of change. And I think also, I mean, for some Catholics, if I may add, go back to my previous point, which I hope was clear, and it sounded a little fuzzy to me, but that's okay. But I think that some Catholics are a little uncomfortable with this because it sounds like the Pope is involving himself in things that aren't really of a spiritual nature, right? This is, is he an environmental scientist? What does this have to do with God? And I think actually Laudato Si, his document, makes a very clear argument about the connection, but I think that this is sometimes a point that is argued. So environmental justice, Laudato Si, climate change, those questions is one part of his legacy. The second thing that I think that is a hallmark of change is that he has embraced the process of what's called synodality, right? The idea of making the church a more synodal organization. Now, again, for the listener who may not be up on all the arcane language that the church uses, this is a years-long process by which the Pope has called for and involved Catholics all over the world in a worldwide conversation about issues of importance to Catholics and the direction of the church. And so this has resulted in actually two meetings of the Synod of the Bishops, which were really meetings of Catholics around the world, in Rome, representatives of these conversations around the world. And for Francis, this effort is not a one-off, if I may put it this way. It's really an attempt to make the church structurally a more listening church, a church that actually listens and has dialogues, even over very difficult issues within itself, and tries to practice a certain form of spirituality to bring about those conversations and to make them fruitful. So again, no one can predict the future. A future Pope may
that's
take
unique,
this in a different
right?
direction.
I mean, isn't that unique? The Catholic Church, I think, has often been seen as a top-down organization.
Yes. And I think what Francis is trying to do is really, without eliminating that hierarchical nature of it, but also to really structurally decentralize it. I mean, if you want a sort of a visual image, during the meeting of the Synod of the Bishops in Rome, there was a big conference room in the Vatican, right? And there are all these representatives from the church, not just bishops, but lay people. We're just sitting around common tables, and the Pope is sitting at one of the tables, right? And talking with other people. And again, that's an image, and sometimes we know that images can be deceptive, but it really illustrates a form of church that Francis is trying to create. And again, it's hard to tell where this is going to go, but I think Francis sees it as a different mode of being the church. And if it persists and becomes part of an ongoing institutional structure, communal idea, then you really have a profound shift in the way that the Catholic Church operates.
Your point about Pope Francis being a public figure really speaks to the idea that not only is he the head of the church, but he's also the leader of the Vatican City as a nation in and of itself. And how does Pope Francis's approach to Catholicism parlay into his governance of the nation state? I know that in the past that there has been controversy surrounding the bureaucracy of the Vatican. I was just wondering if you could speak to that.
Sure. It's an old cliche, but the old cliche was that the popes come and go, but the curia remains, right? The papal court is always there. And this may be a tension that is probably goes back to the Middle Ages, so not easily overcome, and even in one pontificate. But I think what Francis is trying to do is to create some of that same synodal conversation and decentralization in the Vatican Curia itself, right? He has also appointed. He's trying to internationalize the Curia, right? Not just making it, bishops and cardinals from Italy or from Europe or even North America, but from around the world. This is, I think it's a significant gesture, although it is a gesture. He appointed a woman to the head of a Vatican dicastery or bureau not too long ago, which is an unprecedented step. So I think what he has tried to do is to render a certain kind of form of this synodal, international, more conversational church into the structure of the Vatican bureaucracy or curia. This is not done overnight or easily done. The other thing that he's done too consistently is he has not to put a too fine a point on it, railed against careerism in the church. Right, he has sort of really come down very hard on priests and bishops who want to come to be cardinals and or live a fairly luxurious life in Rome and have nice clothes and live in a nice apartment. And I think his commitment to encounter with the poor has been also a call to the Vatican toward a certain kind of simplicity in all of its offices and all of its people. So again, I think that's probably something that is a struggle, but something that he's really pushed. I think he's really against the old sort of idea of the curia, sort of the princes of the church, right? This and where they can go to the fancy Roman vestment shops and get their Berettas and their other stuff like that. So he's really, and I think the very first day that he came out on the balcony, he's wearing these very simple clothes, and this was again, it's a gesture and it's a symbol, but symbols mean something, right? So this is what he was trying to do. I think financially he has tried to achieve a level of transparency. This has not always been successful. Also, the Vatican, is running a deficit. They are really struggling to raise money just to pay for the things that they want to do on a local level. Catholics and others may not be aware, but the Vatican's sort of operating budget, not its assets like property, but its operating budget is fairly small, and so even raising that amount of money has been a challenge in an era when sometimes people are disaffected from the church or they're not giving to charity in the ways that they used to. So there are lots of challenges to do so. So he has this complicated task of being a spiritual leader, as you've said, and also the sort of running the political relationships of the Vatican inside and outside, and also sort of administering the sort of assets and wealth of an organization like that.
Yeah, I mean, he's the CEO, the president, and the Pope.
Wears a lot of hats.
No
It's
pressure.
a lot of hats, and the bureaucracy is there. The curia is there to assist him with this, but it's also it's also this very strange mixture of customs and institutions that again go back to the Middle Ages, if not earlier, or the Renaissance, or if not earlier, and then attempts to sort of integrate them with, I don't know, modern double entry bookkeeping, right? And contemporary security forces, and they do all these things, right? But it's a very strange thing. I mean, it's not a modern business bureaucracy, right? But it has to do some of the things of a modern business bureaucracy, but also in the shape of the vestiges of the old medieval court.
One of the things he's obviously faced is the sex abuse scandal that has swept through the church and cost a lot of money. You talked about money as well. And in a Ipsos Pew poll in 2019, 58% of American Catholics who had heard a lot or a little about the reports of sexual abuse and misconduct believed that Pope Francis was either doing an excellent or a good job at responding to that. I think that that the weight of that has been something that you can't take out of what has happened over the last 10 years. The other thing I want to ask about, though, and I think they go together, is the challenge that the church faces as a business, recruiting members, being relevant. And there's been a lot of, over many decades, there's been a drift away in Western Europe and in the United States from Catholicism to other religions or no religion at all. The growth has been in the global South. Is the church positioned to move forward when the next pope is needed? Has this pope set that in motion, or is it going to be another, moment of reflection, trying to figure out what happens next?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And as you said, the sort of drift away from both affiliation to religion, right? In general, the polls show that quite clearly, particularly among younger people, right? And then, and particularly, and also Catholicism, but not only Catholicism in the United States in Europe is very marked. I would say that two things. So first of all, I think that the one of the strange things about this medieval Renaissance Baroque bureaucracy curia is that the Pope does get over time get to pick the people who will probably elect his successor, right? So the College of Cardinals is largely, by this point in his pontificate, largely made up of people whom he has chosen, and generally speaking, are sympathetic to his particular direction that he wants to lead the church. Now, this does not guarantee anything for any future election. Elections can be surprises, but it's likely, not certain, but it's likely that the next pope will be someone of, how shall I put this, similar bent, right, and his approach. And so I think if I may put it this way, I think the gamble here is that approach, let's say the approach that I talked about earlier about the synodal church, the sort of somewhat decentralized church, the more conversational church, the church that listens and then acts, as opposed to just orders. I think that is the strategy, the pastoral plan to bring, if not to bring more people in, at least to maintain the church as it is, and with a hope that this will be inviting, right, to people who are alienated, who don't have the time for it, who find it irrelevant. So, I mean, that this is a different strategy than the strategy, let's say, that St. John Paul II took with regard to the church and in recruitment, as you put it. So I think that's the direction. Now, it's very difficult, obviously, to say whether that will be a successful strategy. But I think that's the line that's going to be taken if the next pope is anything like this pope.
Dr. Thompson, this has been an incredibly fascinating discussion. I have one more question for you, which I think you already asked through the course of this conversation, but I'm thinking about Pope Benedict XVI, who resigned. He was one of only 6, I believe, popes who resigned from the papacy. Yeah. And prior to his resignation, I think it was about 600 years since a pope had resigned. So my question for you is, how much of it is the man shaping the papacy versus the papacy shaping the man?
Oh, good. Good question. One of the things
give him a good, easy question for the last question.
Yeah, that's okay.
Dude, that's a doctoral dissertation, but go for it.
Yeah, I'm actually technically on spring break, so I've had a few days to recharge my brain cells before taking a good question like that. When I lecture to undergraduates on contemporary Roman Catholicism, I always give a little apology or a caveat saying there are 1 billion Catholics in the world, and usually when we talk about Catholicism, we only talk about one, right? We only talk about the Pope as if he's the only significant Catholic. That's a strange thing, but it's also true because the Pope is a very profile figure, right? And the religion is sort of set up to put that person in that position of being in high profile. So I think that but it is not a dodge, if I may put it this way, to say that the answer to your question is both, right? Because if you're on top of an organization, and not just an organization, but this centuries-long tradition with its particular theological self-understanding. Obviously, the papacy shapes the person, right, when that person steps into that role. But on the other hand, it is obvious to me that the Francis is a different kind of pope than Benedict, right? Francis is a different kind of pope than John Paul II. And so that person's particular understanding, education, experience, geographical location, history, all of those things come into play, all right? John Paul II was really shaped by the Cold War, right? And Benedict was shaped by the secularization of Europe, right? Francis is shaped by something else. And so I think that so I think the papacy does shape the person, but I think that the person who comes into the role is going to take it in a particular direction, how he is going to interpret that centuries-long legacy. So, and again, if it's likely that the person who is going to be elected next, whenever that takes place, will be of a similar bent, but that person will also, even if he's similar, but he may be from, I don't know, he could be from the Philippines, he could be from someplace else in the world, and that would shape it differently as well.
Just
sorry, that's
as
a
it did
theologian's
with
answer.
him, since he was from Argentina and South America, and that was a first as well. So yeah,
that was
point.
the first Jesuit. Right.
Yes.
All those things were significant. All those things were significant. So.
Daniel Spree Thompson, professor at University of Dayton in Religious Studies. Thank you so much for joining us. This was fascinating, and we talked about a lot of things I didn't think we'd get to. So I really appreciate it. Thanks for coming on.
Well, thank you very much.
Okay. Fun fact time, and you may have recalled from the opening, Jay grabbed the tissues after sneezing. He didn't really sneeze. It was a fake sneeze.
It was a fake sneeze. You gave it away.
Theatrical. But anyway.
But well done.
Very well done. And it triggered all kinds of reactions on our part. CBS News in 2018 did ask a national audience whether people suffer from spring allergies. And the yes, 38, no, 62. I'm a little surprised, again, by that number, because I would think, I think spring allergies are kind of common. But I'll go around the circle. Mary, what's
You're rubbing your eyes, I'm going to guess.
Yeah.
right here?
Actually, I suffer from spring allergies, not diagnosed, but I know that I have spring allergies. My eldest has very bad spring allergies. And in fact, just last week, he said to me, he looked really, forlorn. And I asked him, Mike, what's going on? He's like, my allergies are back. He's like, I'm all stuffy and I'm sneezing. And I said, oh, buddy, it's okay. Well, we'll take care of it. So yes, he has them very badly. He's really the only one. I think we all have a touch of them, but he's the one who really, really feels it the most.
So if in your household there's 5 and 2 say yes, that's 40%. And the number nationally is 38. You're very representative. Barb, how about you?
Well, what's interesting is I would deny that I have spring allergies. In fact, I would deny that I have allergies. But then I have a runny nose most of the spring. So I guess there's something to be said to, being a little bit more aware of identifying, what's going on. I don't think it's certainly not uncommon to be overly sensitive to a lot of the things that are going around in the spring, but I certainly wouldn't want to change spring for any kind of relief.
Any other season. But Barb, I will ask you, however, this was done with humans. Were we having a methodology that dealt with horses and dogs?
No. No, actually, animals are also very likely to have different kinds of allergies. In fact, my Icelandic horses, although they don't have specific allergies, well, that's not true. Blasi does have some allergies to the early grasses and the sproul, but Icelandic, particularly those who are imported from Iceland, very often do have allergies to the different vegetation and the trees and the different growth that we have here, just in general, and also the lovely bugs that emerge once things get warmer.
I'm going to go to Jay in a second, but don't forget your blue-tick coonhound, who is a vegetarian because of his allergies, correct?
Yes. Well, actually, he has allergies to common proteins. So we had to find some uncommon proteins. So he's still a meat eater, but to kangaroo fans out there, I'm so sorry, but that is considered an uncommon protein for American hound dogs, as is alligator. So that is what he feasts on.
All right, Jay, this is a tough segue. There is no segue. So you just follow alligators and blue-tick coonhounds with some comment about spring allergies.
I think everybody has some allergies. It's not diagnosed, but everybody gets a little sniffly or with all the stuff in the air. I don't have any diagnosed allergies, but I definitely feel it. The spring allergy thing that what this question reminded me of is when I lived in Phoenix a long, long time ago, tons of people had terrible allergies in Phoenix. And I always found that remarkable because people had moved to the desert to get away from that. And as it was explained to me by people who had lived in the valley, which is what the Phoenix area is called, for 50 years, at that point, they all moved here from the Midwest with their allergies and planted all the trees that gave them the allergies, and so they have their allergies again. So there's my spring allergy story. Can you explain the salutation you gave me when I sneezed in the open before we go?
Sure. I had a long Yiddish phrase that my grandmother used to say, which basically translates roughly to...
Well, what is it? Say it first and then translate.
I said gesund, which is very close to Gesundheit because of the similarities between Yiddish and German. So that was so I said Gesundheit Leben Gedir Gesund, which basically means be blessed and have a healthy year. That's not a precise translation, but I got most of it. The problem, of course, is if someone sneezed 3 or 4 times in a row, it required my grandmother to have a lot, and she'd take up most of the morning with that kind of response. But anyway, that's what in response to a diminishing number of requests, that is what that means.
That'll do it for Poll Hub this week.
Poll Hub is produced by the Marist Poll at Marist University in Poughkeepsie, New York.
Mary Griffith is our executive producer. Casey Schaff is our production supervisor.
The Poll Hub team includes Neil Viswanathan, Hunter Petro, and AJ Gambino.
If you enjoy Poll Hub, please consider leaving a review.
Positive reviews help other listeners like you find us.
If you'd like to learn more about polling and survey science, check out the Marist Poll Academy, our free online learning portal.
If you have questions for us, tweet them at us at Marist Poll.
Remember, you can always tell your smart speaker to play Poll Hub.
And with any luck, it'll cooperate.
Finally, wherever you listen to Poll Hub, there is a subscribe button.
Click it, and the latest episode will be ready for you in your podcasting app as soon as it's released.
We'll see you next time.
Lightning, see